welcome to a New Year episode of the Kids Media Club podcast. Happy New Year, everyone. My name's Jo Redfern.
I'm Emily Horgan, and who do we have with us today, Andy?
Hi, everyone. So we have Michael Hirsh, the founder of Nelvana, with a 5-decade-long career in animation, and the author of Animation Nation. It's fantastic to have you on the podcast, Michael. So thanks so much.
Well, thanks so much for having me on.
We're very pleased that you're here.
Yeah, our pleasure. Could you kind of give us, just to kind of get us started, Michael, would you be able to just give us a brief introduction in terms of how Nelvana got started and kind of your journey into animation?
Sure. So Nelvana got started by myself, Clive Smith, and Patrick Loubert. Clive came to us from London. Patrick and I were students together at university here in Toronto. And I was making experimental films since I was in high school and started making films, including Patrick, in university as well. And when we left university, or just about the year we were leaving, a friend of mine got a commission from Sesame Street for the first year of Sesame Street to do 5 letters of the alphabet in plasticine animation. And he asked me, because he was fully occupied in something else, if I could bring together a team of people he would train us on how to do plasticine animation, and we would make the shows and he'd be happy. So we learned how to do plasticine animation from him, did 5 letters for Sesame, which are still on YouTube, which is always amazing to me, what you can find on YouTube. And at the end of it, we said, well, we really enjoyed this. We want to keep going. And he said, well, he didn't. He wanted to just go back to his job and not disrupt his life, and was happy to move on. So we started a little group called Laugh Arts, and that evolved into Nelvana. And when we started Nelvana, we also came across Canada's comic books that had been published during World War II, because American books were stopped at the border because Canada entered the war with the UK. And so there was a demand for comic books that was not being met. They started producing Canadian comics. And one of them was a comic book called Nelvana of the Northern Lights. So we did a lot of projects with these comics. We acquired the rights to them, and we decided that while Laugh Arts was a great name, clients or potential clients told us they couldn't hire us as Laugh Arts because people often mispronounced it as Lafarts, because we spelled it Laffarts. So,
oh dear,
changed our name to Nelvana, which was really a great image for a company out of Canada, because she was Nelvana of the Northern Lights, and it just had great mythology and imagery. And so we built the company up. We were doing shorts and little things. And then students from Sheridan College, which was new at the time, started to graduate from their animation program. And there really, other than a few who might go to Disney at the time, there just wasn't any demand for animation people, but they were cranking them out. And they came knocking on our door saying, you guys are doing these little bits and pieces, but, we can do features, we can do TV shows, we can do anything. So we did our first fully animated special, which was called A Cosmic Christmas, and we got worldwide distribution from Viacom, got into the US, got syndicated in the US. And fortunately, the short, or the special, was seen by George Lucas at a time where he was looking for an innovative animation company to do the first Star Wars cartoon for what's known as the Star Wars Holiday Special. So the cartoon was called The Faithful Wookiee. It introduced Boba Fett. And that really helped launch us in a bigger way. Like, we were already beginning to be launched. Now, with having been chosen by Lucas, we were now network acceptable in the US, which was a big deal in that day. In that day, you couldn't get hired by a network unless you were on their little list. And it was Hanna-Barbera and Filmation at the time who dominated the business and probably represented like 95% of what was on Saturday morning, which was where animation lived at the time. So that's how we started Nelvana. And that's how I got into animation, from doing experimental filmmaking, and made the transition to, this great industry.
And looking back to 1978, when you made that animation for George Lucas, and obviously, given what Star Wars has become, how do you feel when you look back and think, actually, you made the first animated Star Wars holiday special?
Well, I feel very fortunate, because what happened is, so we were sitting in Toronto, and there really wasn't an animation industry here. There was not much of an industry in the US either at the time, right? This was a down moment in animation. And although I'm not sure there was an up moment in animation before that, right? Disney was still making their films, but the boom was to come. So we felt fortunate to work with Lucasfilm because all of a sudden we were working with the best sound people, the best designers, and we learned a lot. And as a studio, we benefited from that relationship. We went on to do Ewoks and Droids for Lucasfilm and for George. And that was a great relationship that really helped sort of pull us up to among the top ranking studios.
Yeah, definitely. And it started with Star Wars, but obviously you guys went on to do so many major brands that a lot of us grew up with. I mean, what are the highlights for you?
So there are a lot of highlights. As I think through the decades, after Star Wars, the next big opportunity was Care Bears. We made the Care Bears movie, and then we did the Care Bears series for Saturday morning, and a syndicated Care Bears series followed that. And that led us to great projects like Tales from the Crypt Keeper, which was the animated version of the Tales from the Crypt series, based upon the Tales from the Crypt comic books. There was Beetlejuice for Tim Burton, which was a great highlight. The Magic School Bus working with Scholastic, working with Maurice Sendak on Little Bear and Seven Little Monsters, Mickey Paraskevas on Maggie and the Ferocious Beast, Franklin, based upon the books written by Paulette Bourgeois and illustrated by Brenda Clark. Babar, I left out Babar, which was a major highlight. It was one of the books that really got me interested in this field of children's entertainment, because as a kid, I went to the library and the librarian would read from Babar, and I'd take Babar books out and read them at home. And my background is I was born in Belgium and we moved to Canada when I was 3. So I had this Francophone background that made Babar more interesting than it might to just anybody, like a normal kid in Toronto who was Anglophone. And then we did Tintin, working with the Fondation Hergé. We had a studio in Paris that we built in partnership with Canal Plus called the Studio Ellipse at the time, and did a number of interesting projects. We did Rupert Bear, Pippi Longstockings, Never Ending Story, all in animation. So those are highlights. And then there were a few live.
I do feel like I put you on the spot to name all your children and not forget any at this stage.
I'm going along the characters above your head.
Me too.
Well, they're favorites, right? There's the Doodlebops up there, which I did at Cookie Jar. It was a show I co-created with the songwriter. And they were a very successful kids singing group. I'm not sure they really made it in a big way to Europe, but in the US and Canada, they were big on Disney Channel, the US and CBC here.
So that was the heyday of Saturday morning TV, which I would thank you for. I literally had that Care Bears movie on a VHS that I played to death. But obviously things these days are a lot different. I feel like that Saturday morning, although a lot of us hold tight to it, and I think it's an important inspiration, things are very, very different for kids media consumption today. I mean, how have you seen the evolution from that kind of era through to maybe I would say the heyday of the networks, so Disney Channel, Nickelodeon, kind of absolute fandom, and then through to now where the fan club or the clubhouse is maybe a little bit more eroded?
Yeah, so I think the evolution of how we watch TV has been dramatic over that long period, right? So in the early years, it was disrupted in the 80s with the introduction of cable specialty channels like Disney, Nickelodeon, and Cartoon. And Fox came in and disrupted it further with Fox Kids. The next phase, when YouTube appears, at first it looks like it's not that great quality, but you become interested in it because it's growing and the quality is slowly, steadily improving. So when we see, what I consider to be the real growth of streaming, and particularly starting with YouTube, the quality really starts to get better by 2010. But on the other hand, a lot of companies are staying away from YouTube because they don't want to have their programs fragmented and diluted, and they don't understand the value of it. And so that is a lesson that we kind of learned over the next decade. The introduction of Netflix and Amazon, who were the first really strong leaders in streaming on a subscriber basis, was very important. At Cookie Jar, which was my second company after I sold and left Nelvana, we became the leaders in supplying Netflix and Amazon with kids programming because the majors were, they were toes in, toes out, but they really were afraid of this new medium. And so they really didn't commit fully to it. And so we ended up supplying what we had as a library because at the time, when I formed Cookie Jar, I formed it by acquiring two studios. So whereas Nelvana was bootstrapped from the hard work and sweat of my partners and myself, Cookie Jar started by buying Cinar, which was a successful company that was known for Arthur and Caillou, but had fallen into financial scandals and hard times. So I was able to buy that. And then we bought Deke, which had a great library, co-produced Inspector Gadget with Deke back in the 80s. And that was part of the library. So I loved getting the Deke library because it had Care Bears and Strawberry Shortcake in it too, because they brought it back in the early 2000s. So we now had this large library, and it was also the financial meltdown. So we were in trouble as a company because we had grown quickly and had taken on debt. We were saved by streaming because streaming needed a lot of content. And so we focused on delivering that. And then it started to help us maximize the value. So one of the things that's kind of interesting is in the past, like over the 4 decades before this last decade, the introduction of new distribution platforms like cable specialty, home video, pay TV, they were all additive. You could sell a show to one, create a window for the other platform, et cetera, and work to maximize the value of a show. So the value of a show to a producer grew dramatically during that really 2-decade, 3-decade period. So it was a great business, and we saw animation in a golden age and booming. And in the early days of streaming, it was additive as well. But once the public really grabbed onto streaming and realized this was a better platform because you could have shows on demand, you could have huge volumes of shows on demand, bigger volumes than you ever had before. You had the ability to, skip the credits, which as a producer I loathe, but on the other hand, as a consumer, you understand it. You had the ability to binge watch. There were all these, you had mobility, you had all sorts of things that were working in favor of this new platform. So streaming basically has been killing slowly but steadily all of the legacy platforms for entertainment in particular. And I guess as they move into sports, I think they'll have that impact in the long run on sports. So we're really sitting at a moment that really has caused a lot of confusion among producers in the last, say, 4 or 5 years, because we had a peak where everything was still additive and people were making more shows than ever, and the demand from the streamers was very high. So now we have seen a few years where the decline in production is causing layoffs, causing young people joining the industry to not see the easy avenue in that they did before. I think before, the demand for animators was so great that people generally got jobs as they left school and could count on a good livelihood. Well, I think the industry is still generally healthy. It got overheated, and we're sort of seeing, the short-term effect of it.
Yeah, there was an enormous appetite, wasn't there, for more content. Then recently, that's been hit into reverse really effectively. And so your kind of feeling is that ultimately the streamers, from being additive originally, have become kind of cannibalistic in terms of how much they take of content.
Andy, I object. It's not a feeling. It's a reality.
Yeah. Right? Sorry. Your observation.
We're now far enough along into it that we see that, the Cartoon Network doesn't really exist anymore, right? It may be on fumes.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's basically dead. Nickelodeon is largely dead. So everything has moved over to streaming. And there's like a little bit of life left in the channels, the cable channels, but not a lot, right? So we're
absolutely.
Really, pardon?
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree. I feel in some ways that golden era in terms of Cartoon Network and Disney Channel and Nickelodeon, that benefited from the fact that each of those channels had quite a distinct identity. So they were looking to commission different animation, but they were also looking to compete for eyeballs. And now, in some ways, I think a lot of that stuff gets lost on Netflix that doesn't really have a strong animation or kids profile, I don't think.
No, I think the problem that we all face, whether it's a kids programming or prime time programming, is that the streamers, because they have such a large volume of offerings, they've never really been strong at promoting any one show. Their
Yeah.
strength is in being the supermarket where you come in knowing what you want. So all of a sudden producers, to some degree, producers always had to promote their own shows. But the amount of energy and money that you need to spend to help create a hit and the number of years is greater than ever before. And the other problem is that the streamers don't necessarily see the value in building any one brand.
Yeah.
They're focused on building subscriber lists, retaining subscribers, reducing churn, but they aren't about let's have a hit show so that one show really breaks out.
Yeah, and particularly in kids and animation, I don't know if maybe more in kids, I don't know whether the streamers feel like there's any pressure to define their position or branding within that market. My background originally was in promotions for Disney Channel and Nickelodeon. And there you had everyone each week would have 13 shows on their mate list that they'd have to promote. And there was an immense amount of creativity and energy that went into that just isn't replicated.
No, so producers now have to do that. And the producers always had to do that, but it wasn't as hard. So at a time of appointment viewing, you knew you got at least some tune in to a show based upon the lead in and the history of the viewership or, sort of ratings on that episode or that time slot. So without appointment viewing, we have an issue. And one of the other issues is that binge watching, while it seemed great at the time, because people consume more content, therefore the streamers ordered more content. Binge watching has taken away one of the characteristics that's really important in kids' television, which is scarcity. So you know how in toys, successful toy company always underships against demand by 5 to 10%. And that way the stuff moves off the shelves. There's demand for the next year. You continue the line. But on television, what scarcity did was it made you go to the TV set at 9 a.m. or 8 a.m. or whenever you were watching.
Yeah, it built.
Yes, and so the other thing about scarcity too was the onus was on you to basically make a point of being there, right? Whereas now you just go to the set and you get to choose from 10,000 shows or whatever you're being offered, right? So it's they call it the paradox of choice. Choosing what you're going to watch is also harder than ever before. And there was a time when it was hard because there were so many channels, but this is a whole different level. So that's the world we're in now. And what excites me about today and, makes me enthusiastic about the business moving forward is the fact that YouTube has become so successful and has such a big sort of audience. And we've seen the pattern, and I experienced it in part at Frederator because Frederator was, one of the early leaders it was probably the first MCN. And at Frederator, we not only made cartoons, before I got there, they had made Adventure Time and Fairly Odd Parents, which interestingly, we co-produced at Nelvana, Fairly Odd Parents. But they had this great history and legacy of making great shows. But when I got there, they were also managing 5 billion monthly views on YouTube. And so I saw the power of YouTube growing. And the other thing was we had shows that we started on YouTube, like Bravest Warriors and Bee and Puppycat as two examples. And those shows caught on there and went on to being sold into the world of regular broadcast, including Netflix.
I feel that's really hopeful, Michael, because I'm not sure many people would have predicted that you would say that the most exciting thing you think about the current moment is the success of YouTube. And I would also say from experience and from talking to many producers out there that the success of YouTube is nearly the least, is the most frightening thing they see about the current reality of the industry. So I feel like there's so much hope there. And I would agree with you, but
yeah, I know. That's why I wanted to be on your show talking to you, because there's only a few of us who I think have been making that claim, right? And I think Evan Shapiro, and I'm not sure whether you have the same terminology you use as Evan, but the terminology I like is this creator universe, right? So when I look
Yep.
at what's fundamentally changed when I started, you really needed an animation studio, because to do any serious animation project in the old days was hand drawn. You needed hundreds of people. You needed the Oxbury animation stand or its equivalent. You needed editing equipment. There was a lot of infrastructure that was required. And today, a young person who's just starting out can go on YouTube, not YouTube, but go on the internet, find tools that are available to them for free or inexpensively, and start making their own shows, build up an audience on YouTube. And what's great about YouTube is, like, I used to have to sell CBS, ABC, NBC, or BBC, ITV, et cetera, and all the channels around the world
All the
in order
acronyms.
to finance a show. Well, you can actually make a show yourself and you can place it on YouTube. Nobody's telling you not to place it. Maybe if you break one of the YouTube rules, but for the general content, it's generally, easy. You put it on YouTube. And if you're good at using the social networks, you can promote a show and build an audience. And if you're speaking to people in a genuine way, you build that following. And that following means you get views, which means, and screening time, which means eventually, if you catch on, you make money. You then
Yeah.
can spend money with friends, bringing them in to help work with you on your project and build your own little infrastructure of people. And then if something gets big enough, like the circus show out of Australia or,
Yeah.
Hotel Has-Been and many other examples, you get a commission from a Netflix. And what's happened is really, the world of the streamers and the world of cable channels has evolved so that everybody is prepared to let you launch things on YouTube. At Mainframe, one of my last companies, we did Unicorn Academy for Spin Master and Netflix. And, we launched on YouTube and we launched on Roblox with Netflix's support, with Bee and Puppy Cat when it went on Netflix. They encouraged us to put a few shows on YouTube to sort of let the audience know it was coming to Netflix and build it up. So we're seeing a much different, nobody is that interested in exclusivity. They're interested in maximizing their audience.
Yeah.
And if you do that by sharing a show and having it promoted through other networks, that's happening. But we're in as good an environment as ever, except that it's harder to get a commission. You have to build up the brand to get the commission. And it's essentially, in a way, we have what in American terms they would call the minor leagues, right? Where you have to sort of work your way up to the major leagues, and the major leagues will pay you big for something that's already got demand, right? So as a young person starting out today, I'm talking to a lot of kids who are studying animation in schools, like in colleges, et cetera. And I'm telling them, start making your own shows, putting them on YouTube, build up your following and your brand. And one of the things that's exciting is that a lot of the animation that's working is a lot more like short story writing used to be, where you get a personal point of view. And so the author's point of view, the author's imprimatur, is really critical to building that following, building that audience, and engaging, right?
I'm interested in your thoughts because I completely agree with what you're saying. I think younger people who are looking to tell their stories and to create are finding ways to do it. They understand that it doesn't happen overnight. They're trying, they're testing, they're learning. Their authenticity shines through in a way that actually means, and they don't actually have to produce in what we would class as that kind of high quality bar. And this is what I'm interested in exploring, because we hear a lot of chat and we read a lot of debate about it. I think that it's the small and medium sized studios and production companies that are really going to struggle going forward, because I think the younger people and new entrants are not afraid to lean in. They're not afraid to test and learn. They know that if they can start gathering an audience on those platforms, they can scale it. I was reading recently about 1,000 true fans. If you've got 1,000 true fans, you can more or less keep something going. And if they spend $100 a year each on what you are creating, then you've basically got a business. But what about those studios? And again, we could talk about Canada, or we could talk more broadly, that are kind of stuck between that kind of very small, nimble way of working and the big studios that can self-sustain. What do you think the future is for those producers that aren't getting those commissions but have got a pay bills and rent and people.
Well, if you're not getting the commissions, you're not paying the bills, and you're out of business. So we've seen a couple of French studios that have gone out of business. In Canada, people have sort of struggled. There's no question they're struggling, but they're getting enough of work to, I think, stay alive, but they're not thriving like they were. But the way that I look at the industry is in the same way that the legacy platforms, distribution platforms like cable and pay and home video are either dead or dying, there's going to be room for studios that can produce premium quality and supply the Netflixes and the Amazons and the Apples of the world. And that's going to be a niche that plays. But there's only going to be a demand for so many of those. But on the other hand, the other thing that's happening is simultaneously with the lower, demand through less commissions is the growth of AI and how that's going to change those studios. So one of the problems you have is if you have a studio where you have a lot of infrastructure, you've got a lot of commitments to training that happened on previous software. And you have a lot of equipment that may or may not be necessary. You may need the next generation of equipment. So all of a sudden, your cost, you may be stuck trying to keep certain distributions, certain software programs alive in your studio because you've already invested in it. But you've got to move quickly into the next generation once it's available and once it's generating the quality. Meanwhile, the early AI will be usable by the young people we were talking about who can make a show, and they're making it for first themselves and their friends. And as you were saying, quality can steadily improve. They don't have to start. They're not making premium quality for YouTube typically, though there are exceptions. But basically, they're making basic quality that is satisfactory to, a small circle of people. But as that circle grows and they start to be able to make money from it, they can start to invest in it. And as AI improves, their quality will improve in part because of what they get through AI. So we're really in one of these transformation moments, a shift moment, the way a lot of industries are. But that's how it's going to play out here. I think there'll still be a demand for the people who can do great stuff. And the big commissioning networks will pay up for that because they identify as premium channels and they premium services, and they want to deliver the high-end quality. So when we did Bee and Puppycat, they wanted a slightly higher quality than the YouTube quality for Netflix. And so this is something you hear from them all the time is, they want to step up, right? So all in all, I think we're in this great shift moment of transformation. I don't believe there's a lot of big future for lots of, independent animation studios. But, if you're a studio that can produce the premium quality and keep up with the technological change, I think you have a future. But there's only so many that will survive because that's the way the game is going. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, as young people enter the field, they will basically be the innovators using the new technology, and they aren't stuck with old technology because they're new and entering. So it's kind of an exciting moment to be a young player. Earlier I mentioned I started as an experimental filmmaker, and it would have been much easier for me to have a career as an experimental filmmaker in a world of YouTube. Mm-hmm. Because I would have had a place to place my shows. In my day, I had to go to open screenings at the Filmmakers Co-op and various sort of cooperative ventures that had screenings for people of like mind who were interested in experimental film. And so you had to sort of take your film and your audio, which were often separate in those days, and trek down to a location and put it on the projector and hope that the splices didn't break, etc. So it was really not a convenient, mode. Whereas today, you make that film, you stick it on YouTube, and it either builds an audience or not, or you make the next one until you do.
But on that, Michael, though, because that's the issue, right? You make it, you spend time making it, even if the overheads are lower and the technology is more accessible, there's still probably a cost to it. There's definitely a time cost to it. Where does the funding come from that startup phase, and also then with kids content, one of the issues is you hit critical mass of audience on YouTube, but the monetization isn't there on the other side anymore, like it was. So monetization and
is,
revenue on YouTube is has been significantly impacted in the past 5 years.
yeah, no, that's correct. But I think what you're going to see and what you're seeing actually is a lot of this content does reach monetization. But I think, you
Yeah.
have to spend, a couple of years building your audience. So at Frederator, we were managing channels for Jaden at the time, who's a young animator who started I think she was a young teen. And she eventually was making 7 figures. But her shows weren't kid shows.
Yeah.
And a lot of this stuff that people are going to make, I think, isn't going to be kid shows. There's going to be, because they're personal films about what you're experiencing, they're reaching that tween and young adult sort of audience and carrying on. At the same time, people who want to work with kids will make their shows for kids, and they may spend a little bit of money, but they're going to generally be looking to merchandise and license what they do, and they're going to look to build a brand. So, as a producer with a background, as I look at what I might do in the future, it's all based upon building brands using YouTube, using the ubiquity of being on a lot of channels, and eventually, working with the streamers with a brand that I've built and has demand.
Yeah.
But that's really exciting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's really exciting. One of the things I have noticed, I think, is that one of the outcomes of the changes to YouTube has been that a lot of the young audiences ended up leaving YouTube Kids and then watching the mainstream YouTube channels. So
Yes.
my wife's a primary school teacher, and one of the, the biggest YouTubers for all of her class are undoubtedly creators that wouldn't fit into the kids category, Mr. Beast or Sidemen or people like that. So the irony of some of those changes is that the audience then went for other content on YouTube.
The kids always find a way.
Exactly.
No, that's right.
Yeah.
And they don't want a ghetto.
No.
They don't. Absolutely, they don't.
Who wants to be in the ghetto?
Yes. Yeah, absolutely.
I'm interested.
Well, that's exciting. No, I'm just going to say that's exciting and really encouraging, and a positive view of kind of animation creators on YouTube. So, yeah, thanks for that.
Interested to hear from you, Michael, because it's come up how certain things, what goes around comes around often.
Yes.
And you spoke about how graphic novels and comics were the source of IP when you very first got started. And of course, now we're seeing anime and mangas having a resurgence. And you've worked with publishing properties, Scholastic over the years. As you look forward, where do you see as those new sources of IP? Notwithstanding that some do come back around, but what excites you about new sources of IP?
I think there's never anything better than an individual's creative original project, right? So an author creating something, working on it, building it up. And that's what's been happening no matter what the medium. So it really comes down to the ability of people to create new ideas, new characters. And when you look at what succeeds, it's always fascinating to me. And the streamers are repeating the cycle we saw before. So they really want pre-sold properties that have built up a following, and are reluctant to take something that's totally fresh, in kids programming. And that was the case with the networks. And it was the case with cable specialty channels too. So you were always looking for something that had this sort of pre-sold value. But when you look at what are the biggest hits, they're things that don't have a following. So Bluey, when it went into the US, really was built up with the Disney Channel. Peppa Pig was built up in the US with Nickelodeon. Nobody knew Peppa Pig from anything else, really, in a big way. Back in the day, when Teenage and Ninja Mutant Turtles broke, it was an underground comic book. It was not read by kids. Nobody knew it. When Mighty Morphin Power Rangers came in, kids didn't know it in advance. So the biggest hits in our business, and Smurfs, you look at Smurfs in the US, nobody knew from a Smurf. In Europe, they did, but not in the US. So the history of children's television tells us the biggest hits are things that are fresh, but that's the hardest thing to sell. Thus it was, and thus it continues. But that's why having, YouTube and all these other channels to potentially build a following on and build an interest in is great. So that's
it certainly seems it worked for the Amazing Digital Circus, didn't it? I mean, that was purely discovered and championed by audiences on YouTube who are searching around and who are hungry for new, perhaps, but aren't being served it in the traditional places.
Yeah. So in a sense, again, if you think of it in the terms that I was using of minor leagues and major leagues, YouTube, while it gets the biggest following, is in a way a minor league because, you have to build an audience, you have to build an income stream, and you have to do a lot of work to create that interest in that audience. But people do. I can't imagine, maybe I'm wrong, you probably might know more about it. Did the Amazing Digital Circus, did it spend a lot of money to promote itself in the US on YouTube to get Netflix's attention? Or did it happen virally and naturally?
I don't actually know whether, I mean, they already had some almost cult hits of their own previously, and they certainly leveraged that existing audience. But it seemed to me that it was just organic. It blew up because they didn't have many episodes banked when they launched. There was a huge gap between episodes, but that only served to heighten the excitement for when the next episode dropped, to the point where obviously Netflix came in only for episode 3, I think, and gave them the assurance that they could still drop each episode on YouTube. I think it's a full 24 hours before it goes on Netflix. So really, that is some feat of fandom. And I don't think that they spent a huge amount of money to force it. I think it's just good quality, passionate storytelling.
What do we think? Does anyone heard from any little birds how much, like, what the kind of deal with Netflix was with for Amazing Digital Circus? I mean, because I don't get a sense that, it's been bankrolled by Netflix. You know what I mean? Like, they picked it up and it's been bankrolled and it's now production is all being covered by Netflix. I get a sense that, I don't know, they took some nice cash. But does anyone have any gossip?
I haven't heard, but they made a big deal about their deal structure. But frankly, that's a deal structure that Netflix has done many times, right? It wasn't the first time Netflix has done that deal. So Netflix has always had a variable deal depending upon how much they want something, and the less exclusivity they have, generally they pay a little less. But on the other hand, they do believe that success on YouTube generates higher ratings on Netflix, right? They believe that for at least the last 4 or 5 years. So we've seen that over and over again, things launching on Roblox or launching on YouTube, even though Netflix may have bankrolled the whole thing. So if we hear from little birds, we'd love to hear, but like having done deals with Netflix for the last, say 16, 17 years, they've had a wide variety of deals. So it wasn't always just one deal.
Yeah. It's just trying to piece it all together, because I mean, I'm obviously just not Googling here. I'm getting on Social Blade to see how many monthly views Glitch is doing, and it's doing over 100,000, kind of, it's probably doing around 75,000 on average, I would say. 75 million, which is good.
Yeah.
But it's like, when you try to break that down to the bare bones revenue, though, you kind of have to look at it, because I thought Amazing Digital Circus, like, that was investment level animation. You know what I mean? That wasn't just an easy AI thing or a bargain basement nursery rhyme thing. I think it was it was beyond. It had edges in actually, I think, a really nice, like a very interesting way, but it wasn't like it was. So maybe didn't have polish in quote unquote air bubbles air quotes way, but it but it was investment animation. It wasn't just really, really for some reason, Annoying Orange came into my head. It wasn't Annoying Orange, right? Like,
no, it was not Annoying Orange. And Annoying Orange was very annoying. But, in its day, Annoying Orange was fine. It was innovative, right?
Yeah.
So, it's like everything changes and evolves. But I would agree with you. I think, it's a good show, and it does show that, investment in the early days. But, frankly, that was, when I look back and, people often ask me, like, how did Nelvana succeed? Because in those days, coming out of Toronto or anywhere but New York or LA, but particularly LA, you weren't going to necessarily succeed in worldwide animation. And we made a decision early on with these great students from Sheridan College to focus on quality. The animation back in that day, in the period of the 70s, very low quality. Hanna-Barbera had driven the quality way, way down to maximize their profitability. They would be focused on having, on the writing and the voices and less in the animation. And we decided, well, let's bring great animation back. And that's what attracted Lucas in watching.
Make animation great again. There's a hat for that.
You're right. The hat is great. But I wouldn't wear it. The other is open to misinterpretation.
Yeah.
Or misrepresentation.
Oh,
If it cracks, it's a duck.
Yes, this is true. So, Michael, I'd love to hear a bit more of your take on the Canadian industry at the moment, because as outsiders, I kind of look at the headlines coming through Kidscreen, and I'm a big fan of the Canadian industry. I feel like Canada and Ireland, there's parallels there. We kind of sit secondary to a bigger market, and we're plucky, we're attractive, we're actually bigger and better than that original market as well. But I'd love to hear a bit more about what you see is happening, because obviously a lot of the companies involved in some of the disruption are children of yours, essentially.
Yeah. So what I think has happened is there's been two trends. One is the US trend that we've been talking about, which is really the global trend. But the US has been very advanced. Now in Canada, because we're a smaller population, the cable specialty channels have actually started to decline faster here. And so we had the misfortune of having 90% of all Canadian children's channels controlled by one company, Course, that was a cable channel and pay TV channel distributor and radio service. And so they are now in dire financial straits. They've stopped producing original stuff and been, and are in probably a restructuring sales sort of process. So the lack of those commissions has hurt the Canadian industry faster than the US. But, the fact that Nickelodeon, Cartoon, and Disney aren't there with lots of commissions, because, we were making shows for them either as, proprietary shows of our own or service shows. And so that market has declined. The number of streamers who are commissioning and ordering shows has declined. So all of that has had an impact on these producers. The same thing is happening at a slower pace in Europe. So, we mentioned before, there are two French companies have gone out of business, Team Toe and Cyber Group. So all of that, translates to less demand, less need for studios. But I think studios are surviving on two ends of the spectrum. The high quality producers who are premium producers. So Mainframe, the last studio that I ran in Vancouver, is producing that high end premium quality and is making, is kind of grown back again, right? It's not fully back to where it was, but it's climbing back. And on the low end side, a few studios that survive by making low end but decent quality are surviving. But there isn't probably the room for this many studios. I think one of the benefits in Canada has been the international co-production treaties that we have, so that we're gaining a bit from work that comes from the rest of the world. But essentially, it's going to be tough times for the industry till it right sizes. And also, we have the introduction of AI, which is going to shake up some of those studios, right? If they're not making enough money to invest in the new technology and software, that's going to be problematic. So as we look forward rather than, sort of what's happening today, I don't see a positive trend for studios for at least a few years. And then when I look at kind of what I think is going to happen with platforms, I do believe that once there's a shakedown in streaming, is Paramount Plus going to survive as an independent streamer? Maybe, maybe not likely, right? Is Peacock going to survive as an independent streamer? Will those two combine? Will three others combine? Who knows? But I think there'll be fewer sort of global streamers in, say, the next 2 to 3 years. And once that happens, I think the room for dedicated SVOD channels that are aimed at kids, but producing high-end or premium quality for kids will become more viable than it's been. So it's not been that viable. Nobody's really making money, but there's a lot of players. But I do think that we're going to see that's a place where there'll be a resurgence in the industry, and that will help drive future growth. But there's a lot that has to happen. I think AI plays a role there, because one of the problems in children's television is if you're starting a channel and you need a fair amount of new stuff to sort of, get people to subscribe to your channel, it takes so long to make an animated show. When I was doing Saturday Morning, which we did in the old hand-drawn way, and we would do a lot of the work in Toronto and then go to Asia for, the finishing of the work, you could get an order in November or December and deliver in August for the September season. And you'd never be late and you'd always deliver. But now, if you're doing, one of the premium shows for television, you're taking 2 years to make it rather than 9 months. So the demand for higher quality has just driven up the amount of time to make the show and the cost, because more time.
Mm.
So AI could shorten that period of production dramatically. And AI may bring the cost down to some level that's more affordable for a new SVOD player. So my hope for the future is really the growth of competitive children's channels again in the future.
Yeah, absolutely.
Amazing. Well, thank you. I think that is a great place to wrap up. I think there is hope. I think what's interesting is you very often have to look back to see a way forward, but actually I think there is a way forward. But to your point, maybe not without a few bumps in the road, but I really like the idea that potentially, because of this paradox of choice, but because of consolidations, we might have those channels, those kids channels, those clubhouses that we spoke about making a bit of a resurgence, which is great, because we've mentioned it before. There was, if you were a Nickelodeon kid or you were a Cartoon Network kid, there was a certain feeling and kudos to your peers that came along with that. And I think it's a shame for younger generations to miss out on that. So let's hope that that's a prediction that you've made, Michael, that we can revisit at some point in the future.
Absolutely.
Let's resolve to make it happen.
Absolutely. Yeah, let's resolve. That's a New Year's resolution I think we can all get behind. Michael, before you go, would you be able to give us a quick kind of plug for your book as well, in terms of what your book Animation Nation is about?
Yeah, so the book tells the story of how, together with my founding partners at Nelvana, we built what was really the first successful studio in Canada to operate on a global basis. We built a great library of characters and built some great brands, and had great success with it. And then it tells the story of how, when I left Nelvana, I built up Cookie Jar through the acquisition of Cinar and Deke, and eventually merged it with DHX, which became Wildbrain, and we built up the leading company in supplying streamers. And then, when I sort of merged in with Wildbrain and stayed for a couple of years as executive chairman, how I left and formed, WoW Unlimited by bringing two companies that at the time were broken, Frederator and Mainframe, turned them around and sold them to Genius Brands, and made myself unemployed. What can I say?
Or a podcaster.
I prefer to be a podcast guest. But, so the book tells that journey and really how we helped to build the animation industry on a global basis, because Nelvana was very effective at not only going to Asia, but coming to Europe. And, we started the studio in Paris. We worked with most countries. We built up an office in Ireland that was there for sales and distribution. And, we did shows with all the major countries around the world, sharing the work and sharing what we learned from others and what we taught ourselves. And so it's really the growth of that business. And it also gets into my personal story of being a young immigrant into Canada and eventually, sort of integrating in. But the fact that I came from Europe really made me very open to European properties. And I talk about how great ideas can come from anywhere, and really the importance of having that global reach. And it's one of the things that I really loved about Netflix, was the fact that they were open to shows from around the world. Whereas in the old days, the US networks didn't buy anything from people around the world. It was the odd show, right? You'd get, a show once in a decade that would sell from somewhere else, if any, right? Like, it would just be almost non-existent, and people would laugh at you if you came from another country and were selling a show in LA. So, you really had to overcome that kind of prejudice. So the globalization and the opening of the kimono, to worldwide producers is something that, again, I feel we were part of at Nelvana by giving people those network credits and experience.
That's
So
fascinating.
that's the story of Animation Nation.
Fabulous. Well, that's really fascinating. And it's been fascinating to chat to you about all things animation and kids media related. So thanks very much, Michael.
Well, and thank you, Emily, Joe, and Andy. Great to spend time with.
Great. Thank you. And thank you to our listeners as well. Please like and subscribe. And don't forget to check out our TikTok and YouTube channels. We'll see you next week.